Friends, we come to you with another study on the subject of God in our study of God's plan for man. We have pointed out to you thus far that God is a real spirit being with a real personal body, soul, and spirit, like other beings. That God has a body like angels have bodies. There are spirit bodies as well as flesh and bone bodies. Now, according to all that we have seen, we have to recognize that a spirit is far different from what we've been taught. A spirit being can and does have real material and tangible spirit form, size, and shape with bodily parts, soul, passions, and spirit faculties. Their material bodies are of a spiritual substance and are just as real as human bodies. We'll see that abundantly when we come to the study of angels and spirit beings in the spirit world in another lesson. Did you know that even human bodies after the resurrection will be able to go through material substance, as did Jesus after his resurrection? He had a real flesh and bone body, as he told the disciples in Luke 24:39, when he said, "Handle me and see. A spirit doth not have flesh and bones as you see me have." And yet in its changed, spiritualized, glorified state, it could appear and disappear, go through material substance, close doors, be visible and invisible, change from one form to another, according to the will of Jesus Christ. And yet, he had a real flesh and bone body, a material substance body. If this be true of glorified human beings, then it can be seen how God, angels, and other spirit beings can have bodies of a material, spiritual substance and be just as real as other persons that we read about in the Bible. Now, God has a spirit body with bodily parts like man. This is proved by hundreds of plain scriptures that do not need interpretation. We will not attempt to interpret any of these scriptures. They are too clear and literal to be misunderstood. All we can do is either deny that the Bible means what it says, or if we're going to believe what it says, then we have to change our theories about God and say, well, God does have a real body, and God must have a tangible substance for a body, or else the Bible could not possibly be true in many places. Now then, I'm going to give you plenty of scriptures now to prove to you that God does have a personal body with bodily parts like other beings. First, God is described as having a body like other persons. In Hebrews 1:3, we read that Christ, being the express image of his person, the upholding of all things by the word of his power. Now there you have the idea that Christ was the express image of his person. In the 7th chapter of Daniel, verses 9 to 14, you have a description of God's body. We read that the Ancient of Days was seen sitting on a judgment throne, and his body was clothed with a garment, and the hair of his head was white like wool, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. In the 10th chapter of the book of Daniel, verses 5 to 7, we have the fact that God's body is mentioned, and God was seen again by the prophet. So, if we're going to believe these statements at all, we have to believe that God does have a real body and real bodily parts like other beings. In John 5:37, we're told that God has a shape. Jesus said, "Ye have never heard his voice at any time, nor seen his shape." In Philippians 2, verses 5 to 7, we have the fact that God has a form. Or we read there that Christ, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery or something to be held onto to grasp that equality or to hold on to that equality, but made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant. In other words, he laid aside his God form to take human form to redeem. Now that proves that God does have a real form as a spirit being. And we read in Genesis 1:26 of God having an image and likeness of a man. For we read of man being created in the image and the likeness of God. Ezekiel 1:26-28 pictures God as having the likeness of a man from his loins upward and from his loins downward. In 1 Corinthians 11:7 and James 3:9 we read of New Testament references to the image and outward form of God. So when we read of the many scriptures speaking of God having a form, having a shape, having a body, and having a likeness and an image like a man, then we have to believe that literally, or else we just have to be fair and just say the Bible's a plain lie in all these scriptures. And that we're not going to do. We're going to maintain that man should be rejected and God believed. We have a statement in Exodus 33:23 that God has back parts. For he said to Moses, I will hide you in the cleft of the rock, and you shall see my back parts. So if he has back parts, he must have front parts and side parts, and so on. We read in Genesis 6:6 and Genesis 8:21 and other scriptures that God has a heart. We read that God said in his heart, and it grieved God in his heart. We read in Exodus 31:18 of God writing the 10 Commandments with his own finger. We read of God's fingers, more than one finger, in Psalm 8, verses 3-6. What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and did set him over the work of thy fingers, the sun, the moon, the stars that thou hast made. In Revelation 5:1, and also verses 6 and 7, we read that God has a hand, and that he has a book in his right hand. John not only saw God sitting on a throne, but he saw his right hand, and saw a book in the right hand of him who sat on the throne. Then we have a statement in Psalm 18:8 that God has nostrils, and in Numbers 12:8 that God has a mouth, and in Isaiah 30:27 that God has lips and a tongue. In Ezekiel 1:27 that God has feet. And especially in Exodus 24:10 we read that under the feet of God there was a pavement when the 74 elders of Israel saw God and had that banquet with him on Mount Sinai. We read in the 11th and 18th and 33rd Psalms of God having eyes and eyelids and eyesight. And we read in the 29th Psalm and the 10th chapter of Revelation and other scriptures that God has a voice, and that he has a breath. Genesis 2:27, he breathed into man's nostrils a breath of life. In the 18th Psalm, the 6th verse, we read of the ears of God. Psalm 11:7, we read of the countenance of God. In Daniel 7:9-14, we read of God's hair, the very color of his hair, and of his head, of his face, and of his arms, and of his body being clothed with a garment. In Ezekiel 1:26-28, and also the 8th chapter, verses 1-4, we have the fact that God has loins, like a man, from an appearance of a man, from his loins upward and from his loins downward. We read of the bodily presence of God in Genesis 3:8, and also in the 18th chapter of Genesis. God appeared to Abraham in the plains of Mamre with 2 angels. All 3 of these persons had real bodies, and appeared to Abraham and had a banquet with him on Mount Sinai. And so it goes. We can give you many places in the Bible where God is pictured as having a body with bodily parts. When I went to a Bible Institute as a young man out on the West Coast, they taught me that God was an invisible nothingness, that God was just as invisible and nothing as a light as far as tangibleness was concerned. They pictured God as being an invisible something floating around in nowhere, that he didn't have any body with bodily parts. And I brought to them many of these scriptures about God's bodily parts, and they explained it away this way. They said, why, that's a mere human expression trying to convey some idea of God. Well, I argued back at them, what kind of a human expression could it be, or what kind of an idea does this human expression convey about God, that he doesn't have these bodily parts, or that he does? Oh, they say God is a spirit. They did have the knowledge of that one thing about God, that God was a spirit. But they refuse to recognize all these many hundreds of other scriptures describing God's spirit body as being real with bodily parts like a human being. And so I said to them, is that the way you would tell me you didn't have hands, to talk about your hands, what you did with your hands, what you can do with your hands, what you're going to do with your hands? You're really trying to get across to me you didn't have any such things. Oh, no, they said, that isn't the way we would say it. Well, I said, how would you say it? Well, if I didn't have hands, I'd tell you right out, I do not have hands. Well, I said, if God had ever said that one time in the Bible that he didn't have hands, he didn't have feet, he didn't have hair, he didn't have a body, he couldn't wear clothes, he couldn't sit on a seat, he couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, he couldn't see, he couldn't hear, if it ever said one thing like that about God, then I said that would be sufficient. I would take then all these so-called human expressions as being figurative language about God. But friends, I've learned that all figurative language expresses literal truth, just like the figures themselves. In other words, figures of speech convey real ideas, not unrealities. So, when we read of God having a body with bodily parts and soul passions, and he goes from place to place, and he eats food, and he wears clothes, and he rests, and he dwells in a mansion, and lives in a heaven, and he sits on a throne, and he walks, and he rides on chariots and on clouds, and he does other real things, then what is there wrong in us believing in the reality of a God of this nature? Why do we have to question him every time he says anything about himself? Why not believe everything just like we read?